We're in Hebrews chapter 7. I know you're thinking, isn't Sheldon shorter than that? And yes, he is. Chapter 7 is pretty much dedicated to Melchizedek, which is interesting in itself. But look over at chapter 5, verse 12, beginning, and we're going to see what's going on that cranks Melchizedek up. He says, "For by this time you ought to be teachers. But you have need again to be taught the elementary principles of the Word of God. You need milk and not solid food." For people who take milk are not accustomed to solid food. You kind of see that when the transition with the little guys to solids, kind of solids, that takes a little getting used to. The next thing you know, they're eating everything in the house. Solid food is for the mature who, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern good from evil. Now, that is brought on by something that is said in verse 10. He's been talking about Melchizedek. And he says in verse 11, "Concerning him we have much to say. It's hard to explain since you've become dull of hearing." And that means he's not going to try to explain it because chapter 7... But he lets them know that by reason of time, they ought to be farther along than they were. Now, these are Jews who have been converted out of Judaism into Christianity. And one of the things, as we know, that's going on here is the Jews that didn't convert are kind of, and they were comfy with Judaism. They'd been in it all their lives. And for Jews, that was their life. Everything revolved around it. The synagogue was a central place, and that's where their kids got their schooling and everything. So it was not an easy thing for them to transition. So the Hebrews writer is talking about why Jesus is superior. And he's going to, in chapter 7, use Melchizedek to show why Jesus has a superior priesthood. So we get to chapter 7, and there's Melchizedek. So he's gonna school them in Melchizedek, even though they're not as far along as he thinks they ought to be, and they're not. "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him." So back in Genesis chapter 14, we have Lot got taken away. And Abraham gets his people together and gets them. He winds up with a certain amount of stuff that he's acquired by winning the battle. And so he's coming back with stuff. And Salem is what we will later call Jerusalem. I'm sorry, but you're late. You can't come in. Oh, we'll let him in. So that's the place. God had said to Moses that when the people came into the land, because they've got a tabernacle, the movable tent, that he would find a place for his name to dwell. But when they first went into the land, they didn't conquer everything. And Jerusalem was a high up, well-fortified place, and it wasn't until David's time that Jerusalem was conquered, which explains why David, he finds out that this is the place where God's name is going to dwell, and he has the idea to build a temple. It's a good idea as far as it went, and Nathan says, yeah, that's a good idea, and God says, no, really it's not. And he says that Solomon is going to build a temple. So Jerusalem, Salem has a history, and it's a place where a lot of things happen. One of the things that they can't excavate that much there, as much as they'd like, because they're always finding these really neat things, but they can't just do what they would normally do in a city to excavate it, because guess what? There's a mosque there. In fact, on the place where the temple was, there's the Wailing Wall. That's a retaining wall. It was a retaining wall for the temple that was built up, the top part of it. So the Muslims have the Dome of the Rock, and that's not going to have anything happen. You keep hearing these premillennial theories that are going to rebuild the temple. Don't hold your breath. But it's still a very sacred place. It's sacred for Christians and Jews and Muslims. And this Melchizedek, he's king of Salem. And he meets Abraham, and he's going to be talking about what happened when he meets Abraham. To whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth of the part of all the spoils. It was first of all. So he not only gives him the tenth, but he gives him first of all, best. By the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, Melchizedek, and also King of Salem, which is to say King of Peace. So it's pretty easy to figure out at this point that Melchizedek is going to be used as a type of Christ. And Christ, of course, brings in righteousness and the righteousness of God. And he also will bring peace. On the other hand, he said, the rest of the story, he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. So in a spiritual sense, he did come to bring peace. In a physical sense, there was going to be a lot of resistance. They did crucify him, and that kind of went on for a while, persecuting the early church, and that's why we largely got the book of Hebrews. So, now here's verse 3. It gets into sort of how Semitic people operate in their thinking and their literature. He says, with this Melchizedek guy, he says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually or forever. Well, this doesn't mean that Melchizedek didn't have a mama and a daddy. He did. This doesn't mean he doesn't have a lineage. He did. This doesn't mean that he didn't die. He did. But all we know about him is what we read in Genesis 14. And if that's all you know, there's no genealogy to talk about. There's no mother and father to talk about. There's no death to talk about. He's sort of captured in time in that passage. And he's using that to sort of make an analogy of how he is, in fact, is a type of Christ. And we can immediately see how that plugs into what we just said about him. No, so what he's doing here is he is wanting to tell us about Melchizedek's priesthood. He's a priest king. Now, this has implications as well. And he will talk about that. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. He mentions that later in this chapter. And priests didn't come from Judah. Priests came from Levi. Not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites. Jesus was not born to be on earth a priest, but he was born to be a priest. This is going to draw from the most quoted place in the Old Testament, Psalm 110, where it keeps popping up. It pops up a lot in Hebrews. It pops up a lot here, little bits and pieces of it. And what we find there is that the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. Now, Jesus, toward the very end of his ministry, when he comes in for the Passion Week, and people decide we got to take him out, So the Pharisees and the Herodians, they, have the tribute or tax question to Caesar, and then the Sadducees, they have their "she had 7 husbands, who's she going to be?" situation. Finally, one of the Pharisees who has some sense about him recognizes that he's answering wisely and asks him a very fundamentally key question. He'd already been asked this before in Luke 10, but it's one that, if you know your stuff, you're supposed to know stuff like this. And he says, Jesus does, to love, in Mark's account, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So that happens. And then Jesus is going to kind of close out that moment with a question of his own. And he says, the Christ, we had a sermon on that. The Christ, whose son is he? And they're bam, David. It's true. It comes from David. So Jesus says, okay. And they regarded Psalm 110 as messianic. Now, guess what? They've changed their mind now, but they've done that about a lot of verses. Isaiah 53 is messianic anymore for Jews. But Jesus asked them this question. If the Christ is David's son, and he is, why does he say of him, the Lord said unto my Lord? Why does he call him Lord if he's his son? Because the big bone of contention that Jesus has been dealing with, and that gets them all riled up, is when they have perceived that he is making himself equal with God. And we can't have that. I've told you before, when I was in New Zealand, they had a 3-part thing called Jesus the Evidence. It was actually Jesus, he really wasn't there, evidence, but it was interesting because they had a guy named Blakelock who was internationally known as a theologian, but he was conservative, so they didn't use him for the program. They used a guy that was, how should we say, not conservative. But they're interviewing this Jewish rabbi about Jesus' miracles. And I think surely they did some prep before they did that, but he seemed surprised. I was surprised. The miracles of Jesus, do you believe that he did those miracles? And he said, yes, I do. But if you take a fair, honest look at the text, they're not contrived. They don't look like things that happen when people are just trying to throw something in to get a miracle or two here or there. They fit. They go along with the narrative. I'm confident that surely he did work miracles. And so the interviewer says, so do you believe he was a Messiah? Oh, no. No Jew would ever claim to be God. Well, if you were, you would, but that was that. So that's the big bugaboo with Jesus. Then and now, to some extent, he said he was God. John, in his prologue, he really lets you know that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he says, the Word became flesh, dwelt among us. And no man has seen God at any time, verse 18. The only begotten God who's in the bosom of the Father, he has explained or declared him to us. So this Melchizedek thing is going to get into that aspect of who Jesus is as a priest king, king of peace and of righteousness. So he continues, verse 4, observe how great this man was, Melchizedek. And the point that he makes is Abraham gives him 1/10 of the spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who receive the priest office have commandment in the law to collect 1/10 from the people, that is, from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. But without, and so Abraham has his promises. And we've talked about, we've had lessons on that. You, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater, and that's almost always the case. It's just the general rule. There are a couple of exceptions, but it is the general rule. That makes sense. In this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one receives them of whom it is witness that he lives on. His point that he made, that frozen in time is Melchizedek. And he has no beginning, he has no end, and that's going to be a type of Christ. And, so to speak, though through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So he's saying, okay, they're all tied to their priesthood. The temple's associated with that, sacrifices associated with that. So the priesthood and the things that are associated with it for the Jews are just like, that's not going to change. And he's wanting to show them, well, yeah, it has. And one of the points he makes here is that in a way of speaking, Levi is in Abraham's body, because you'll have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Levi. And so he says, in that sense, Levi is paying tithes to Melchizedek. And so this Levi, he gets tithes from his brethren. He's going to then talk about some of the things that go along with that help us to see that another priesthood was needed after the order of Melchizedek. Because, back to Psalm 110, I will make you a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So, verse 11. If perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there of another priest to come according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? So why do we need another priest? For when the priesthood is changed, of necessity, there takes place a change of the law also. So this is another thing he's kind of tying to that. If the priests are changed, the law has to be changed. So it's kind of getting all the things of Moses in one thing and saying, if this happened with the priesthood, there had to be a change of the law. So it wouldn't be under the law of Moses anymore. In chapter 8, gets into a lot of that about the new covenant. It kind of pulls that out and goes with it. When the priesthood is changed of necessity, it takes place a change of the law also. For of the one concerning whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spake nothing concerning priests. So, if I'm telling you, he's saying, that Jesus is our high priest, and he is. He already has. You could say, but wait a minute, the law doesn't say that we'll have anybody from Judah to be a priest, and it didn't. And so, again, he's adding that to the mix. So we had to make some changes. In chapter 8, when he talks about, when he quotes from Jeremiah 31, and the longest Old Testament quotation we have in the New Testament, he talks about Jeremiah back then, says a new covenant. And that when he said a new covenant, the old, as the King James puts it, was waxing old. It was, because if there's going to be a new one, then this one you got is moving toward that, and it's dying. And so he kind of throws that in as another thing. To the Jews, the law, more than anything else, centered around the priest and the temple and the sacrifices. And so they're all tied together. And it is clearer still, verse 15. If another priest arise according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such not on the basis of law, of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life. So, what does Jesus got as his credentials? If you were a Levitical priest, you had to be able to say, well, here's lineage. It goes all the way back. And he didn't have that. The priesthood under Moses were human beings, physical people, who could say, I'm of this tribe. And so he says, Jesus is a high priest not because he descends from somebody, because he just is what a high priest needs to be. Because with that, he's going to kind of talk about the law and how it was inadequate. Verse 17. For it is attested of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110. For on the one hand, there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. So he's saying the law of Moses, what it said about priests, that was going to be set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there is beginning in the matter of hope with which we draw near to God. So one of the things about the priest, he'll say in 10:4, the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. Okay? So, and that was when he talks about things in chapter 8 about the covenant, he says, finding fault with it. And fault doesn't mean there was something wrong with it, and he made a mistake, and he needs to get that clarified and changed. But that there was something it didn't have that it needed to have to finish the job. The need goes all the way back to Genesis 3 with sin. And there is a need of reconciliation between man and God. And there are things that are put in there to kind of get us from there to Jesus. Now, those things don't roll sins forward. I'm going to try not to rant like I did Wednesday night. I'm just trying to, be calm. I won't sarcastically sing the Rawhide song, rolling, rolling, rolling. But think about it. If they did, then you wouldn't need Jesus. You just roll every year. Why you want to crucify your son? If I'll take care of it. And then Day of Atonement comes, which is huge in Hebrews. You just do it again. You keep doing it till the end of time, and everything's right. But it didn't. It didn't really solve the problem. God forgave on the basis of their plugging into that. But it did not account for the forgiveness. It didn't explain it. It wasn't something that could expiate them from their sins. So something needs to happen. Romans gets into that and talks about how in order for God to be just and the justifier, he has justice in that you are forgiven through Jesus and faith in him. So anyway, back to our story. The law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there's a bringing of a better hope, which we draw near to God. And inasmuch as they were not without an oath, Levi was not through an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he with an oath, through the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. Psalm 110 again. Now, the promise made to Abraham is another thing that he takes up here in Hebrews. And one of the things he says is that that promise trumped the law. And he will talk about how that it's really the promise. It was a thing in Galatians 3 he talks about, Paul does, that what about the law that came 430 years after the promise that was made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And so he points out that the law served the process of fulfilling the promise. And so the promise was the most significant thing. And he points out in Galatians 3:16 that when he said, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, where he says that in Genesis 22, there is associated with seed, which is singular every time, but it's used as a plural. That's just the way it works. And in fact, the surrounding territory, sands of the sea and stars of the sky and all that. But there, you have a singular masculine pronoun. And that, Paul says in Galatians, that's Jesus. That the seed was Jesus. And so the law served its purpose in holding the Jews together, their tutor. That's another interesting translation we get. It doesn't mean what we mean by tutor. We think of it, I used to tutor math, even though I was 20 years old when I got out of high school. I loved math. So it made sense. It meant, in pedagogy, in Greek culture, which is well known to the Jews, that was the person, your slave, that collected your children up, took them to their teacher, and collected them up and brought them home and made sure they did their homework. There is a lot of papyri that survive because from back then, and they mention this pedagogue, this tutor, and nobody ever has a kind word to say about them because they're the ones you get fish homework. Time to get up. But the law served that purpose to keep them in check, keep them doing the kind of things they needed to do till they grew up. And then in Galatians 4, it carries that forward and talks about it's like when one reaches their majority. You might be an inheritor as a child, but while you're in your minority, it doesn't belong to you. You don't own a thing. You don't get it until you come of age. Basically, he's saying God's dealing with people got to be a come of age thing for big boys and girls, if you will, at the coming of Christ in the new covenant. So that's all out there associated with this. Verse 22. So much the more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. The promise, Hebrews writer says, with two things, a promise and an oath. And neither one of them can God lie, so it's a double thing. You know, I'm telling you, I'm promising you, but I'm going to give you an oath as well. Now, so Abraham's big in this, and what he did with him. We got people out there. He just broke right in. I feel so unsafe. So, let's look at that a little bit. Genesis 15, when Abraham has his covenant moment with God. And there, Abraham's all in a dither because he's I don't have a son. And in the law, the Hurrian law of that time, the inheritor would have been Eliezer, his chief servant. And yet he had been told, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And God says, you're going to have a son now. Abraham takes a while to get in gear because he's got the Hagar thing coming up and all this because Sarah's not having a child. But he does what was the common practice for covenant making. The word berit is the word for covenant. It lost its physicality meaning through time, which was to cut a covenant. And in Genesis 15, we're cutting a covenant. He gets birds, he doesn't cut them in half. He gets animals, and he cuts them in half and creates a path. And what would have normally happened is the two people who were in the covenant would have walked down the middle, very graphic symbolism there, and they're basically saying to each other, if we don't keep the covenant, we'll be like these animals. It's death thing, the top covenant thing was. So Abraham doesn't walk through it. God puts him to sleep. And God goes through it by himself. He takes the responsibility of Abraham. He takes the responsibility of human beings, knowing that they wouldn't keep covenant and that he, God, would have to pay the price. Crucifixion. Jesus represents us and our sins and stands in our place and suffers our penalty for us. So there's a bunch of stuff tied into this. Verse 23. The former priest, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they prevented by death from continuing. You got to have a stream of these guys. Plus, there's a whole bunch of sacrifices that need to happen, and one guy's not going to be able to do all of that. You got to have a bunch of folks working together. When Zacharias is visited, who will be the father of John the Baptizer, it's his course or his time. They divided the priests into so they could administer through the course of the year the various things that had to do with the temple and the sacrificial system. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, holds the priesthood permanently. Therefore, he is able also to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for men. Now, people could be close to God before Jesus. We read about them and all that. But there's some things that have to happen to really get what needs to happen. And in the garden, when there was sin, God realized that human beings are crafty folks, aren't they? They're liable to sneak back in and just live forever eating the tree of life. So he stations outside the garden a cherubim so that they can't get back in. When the temple is constructed with meticulous design elements given by God, follow the pattern, the curtain between the holy place and the most holy place had woven into the pattern cherubim. It was basically saying, you can't just go back in there. There's been sin. There's the closeness, if you will. What did they do in the garden? God would appear to them in the cool of the day, and he'd talk to them. They had a relationship. Well, and again, that doesn't mean that people couldn't have a relationship after that, but there are some things that have happened that need to be addressed. And Jesus is bringing that familiarity into the system. What happened if you were to go into the most holy place when you weren't supposed to? Bam. Even if you're a high priest who goes in one day of the year, twice one day of the year, and you just decide to go in there, bam, you're going to have to find you another high priest because you did. So there was that. Now, consider this. Jesus, again, back to the prologue of John, first chapter, he's God. And the Word was God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory. Glory was the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Last verse of the prologue, 18. No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God, the better translation, he has explained him to us. Now, we've talked about from time to time what happens in John 14, that conversation 14, 15, 16, right before he gets arrested and crucified. And after he tells them to not let their heart be troubled, Philip has kind of got the antsies, and he's thinking, but wait a minute. And so he says, if you will just show us the Father, then that will be enough for us. And have I been so long with you, Philip? And yet you say, show us the Father? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So with that in mind, they've been, John in 1 John talks about, we felt him, we touched him, he was a person with us, we were like any other person. Jesus doesn't tell him, now take off your shoes because I'm God. There's a familiarity. That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be respect. Doesn't mean he's throwing reverence out the window. No. But he's doing it on a more intimate basis. One of the names that comes to be used, Father was hardly ever used in the Old Testament. Hardly ever. It's used all over the place because of the familial relationship. But a word that was not used is the word Abba. And that is what a child would say to their father. And so when Jesus is talking about the Father, he will often combine the two, Abba, Father. And so that doesn't mean that in Eastern culture in particular that a child didn't show respect to their father. Yes, indeed, that was a big element of Eastern culture. To an extent, it still is. But they're a child, and they're at ease with their father. They don't just laugh. They play baseball. They play baseball with him, and stuff like that. So there has been a larger degree of relationship, and Jesus has shown us what that looks like. God can be with us, and be with us every day, in everyday life stuff, all the things that we do, with all the people we do it with. He is a God of draw near in Jesus. In fact, that's what characterizes Christianity as one of the distinctions from Judaism. Again, you could have a good relationship with God in the Old Covenant, but not like this. Not like you could unless Jesus was there. He says, for it was fitting for us, verse 26, to have such a high priest, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men high priests who are weak, but the word of oath which came after the law appoints a son made perfect forever. And so the priesthood and the law that it comes out of and all of the things that were in association with that, first of all, it cannot bring about true forgiveness of sins. Secondly, the priests die, and they're fallible human beings. Jesus, while a human being and subject to all things, all temptation, just like we are, unlike the priests of the Old Covenant, yet without sin. And so he is an intercessor for us all day long, and understanding in a very personal way what it's like to be a human being. Now, I think God could have understood that anyway, but this really assures us that he was there. He walked in our shoes. He experienced the things that we do, and he's the one that now is our priest. So there. See you later.